Welcome to week 10. We will be actually covering chapter 10, which is the field of social psychology this week. Here is the to-do list for the week. Let's get right into the objectives of what the chapter will cover. This week you're going to be learning all about how others affect us in our actions and our decisions and our behaviors, and then how we also have that effect on others. So it really is a lot of social interaction, but there's a ton of things that go on kind of behind the scenes that play into that. So we'll be looking at number one, conformity. Why do we conform to the actions of others? Like, what purposes does that serve? How is it useful? How is it not useful or not beneficial? You'll also be looking at compliance. So when we are asked to do something by another person, usually a person in authority, what does that look like and why do we comply? A lot that goes into that are the norms of our society that we live in. So a good deal of time will be spent in this chapter looking at social norms and how they often dictate our roles and our behavior in the roles that we play, as well as what's expected of us, what's common and not common, and how we respond to that. I'll be taking a look at obedience, following directions or following orders, what makes a person obedient or disobedient, if anything. So with that, we'll be taking a look at Milgram's famous obedience study. Some of you might have seen it before, even in other classes or different retakes done of it recently. I've seen it in pop culture, sorts of television shows and things like that. They'll often talk about or mention Milgram, but we'll be taking a look at the original study, and then we'll also be looking at a remake of the original study. So we'll get to that in a minute. So compliance, conformity, and obedience. Those are like the three key kind of areas that this chapter is going to dive into. Behind all that, some of the behind the scene things that go into those factors would be things like attitudes and attitude change. How do we form an attitude or an opinion of something? Where does that come from? And can we change it? Once we've made our minds up about something, how hard is it to change it? And do we necessarily change it at a conscious level? Is our attitudes in our mind often affected at a subconscious level that might compel us to do something or behave in a certain way, and we're not even sure kind of where it came from? So we'll be looking at sometimes too how we can have some disconnection between our attitudes and our behavior, whereas we believe one thing and we do another. And we see this in a lot of domains. Like, we know smoking's bad, but we still do it. Well, why is that? How can there be a disconnect? And we call it cognitive dissonance, when there's a disconnect between something we believe or we know to be true and then what we're actually doing in our behavior. We'll also be taking a look at how impression formation and implicit personality theories play a role when we are making our minds up about a person and we're trying to decide, do we like them, do we not like them? A lot of things go into that. That is the field of impression formation. How do we form a first impression of someone? What kinds of things do we tend to look for in general? And what factors of the person's personality kind of play a role in that. We'll be looking at attribution, theories of attribution, which basically involve our opinions and our making our minds up about something, the causal explanations that we give for why things happen or why someone does something that they do. We want to have an explanation, a cause, like, oh, she said this because, or he did this because. So we're attributing cause there, and that's kind of what plays into attributional theory. This chapter also dives into prejudice and discrimination, which is awesome. They do a really good job, albeit a quick kind of overview. We actually offer in the psych department a class on prejudice, a whole semester, which is awesome. But this will give you a good idea of like, where does it come from? Prejudice that we hold is an attitude. Discrimination is the behavior, discriminating against someone because of a prejudice, i.e. an attitude that we hold. Well, where do those form? How do those start? So we'll kind of break that down a little bit. And then, can it get better? You know, what has research, that's the key word there, what has research shown is effective in reducing prejudices that people hold, okay? Talk a little bit about stress, which piggybacks on the chapter that we covered, motivation, emotion, and stress. There's a little bit in there, but stress can often dictate how we respond to other people and how we interact with others. So they've thrown a little segment in here about that, and the social factors that kind of surround what goes into our stress reaction, because anytime we're reacting to something, we're going to affect other people. So a little bit of that is in there. This chapter also dives into attraction and love. Again, we have a class, Psychology of Love, Psych of Love, here at Westfield. It's a great class. Students love it. But, you know, it really looks at like what makes us attracted to other people, you know, in terms of friendships or in terms of romantic relationships. What is love? Where does that come from? Defining it as sort of an emotion, but more so as an action, an act of being. And so we'll get into some of the theories of love, and then looking at the opposite, aggressive behavior, the biology of aggressive behavior, as well as how aggression is also learned. And this is piggybacking on the learning chapter that we've covered. So I'm hoping that that all of what we've learned so far in the class is building up to this chapter, which is why social psych is usually one of the last chapters or later chapters covered in intro psych, because you kind of need that framework of understanding to get to some of these theories, especially ones that deal with how is a behavior learned, like aggression. We'll end with talking about altruism. You know, how do we act in kind ways without the expectation of anything in return? That's altruism. What does that look like today in our society? Why is it so low in society today? What's happening? And that'll get into a little bit of the bystander effect. You know, how do we act when other people are watching? How do we act when we think other people are around to do something? You know, how does it influence our own decision making? It's a super interesting field of social psych. And so it gets into some interesting studies that were done early on in social psych. You'll see this in some of the videos this week in my psych lab touch on this bystander effect. And then lastly, just looking at the field of social neuroscience. So we've learned a lot about social behavior by looking at the brain. You know, what's going on in the brain when we are in, say, a decision-making process, or when we are influenced by others. There's some cool neurochemistry findings in this area that give compelling evidence for just how our brains are shaped and changed by the world around us. So that's social psych in a nutshell. I've provided you the lecture slides, which again go really nicely if you have them printed out while you're reading the textbook, to have those nearby. Have them nearby too when you're watching the videos. This week we're watching all the videos in episode 16, social psych, plus this extra video here. You definitely want to do the readings this week before you watch this video. So let me say that again. You want to do the readings in chapter 10 and the reading Hawk 40, Obey at Any Cost, first. Then you want to watch this Milgram video, because the Hawk reading is the original Milgram experiment done in the 60s. What did he find? What was his hypothesis? Why was this study so groundbreaking and revealing for human behavior? You got to understand that before then you go into the kind of remake or modern day Milgram study done by Jerry Berger in the late 90s, I believe. He did a remake of Milgram's study, found some really interesting things. Some people were included in the study that were not originally in the Milgram study. So note those differences. I'm not going to say a whole ton there because I want you to see that for yourselves. But he made some changes. Jerry Berger made some changes to Milgram's study to make it a little more ethical, as well as make it more inclusive of different people, backgrounds, etc. And so it got some good results. Once you've done that, you're then ready to go ahead and do the discussion, okay? And this discussion is all centered around Milgram's study, looking at the factors that contribute to people obeying authority versus not. So if I'm a person who is very obedient and I obey authority, and then I have another friend who is very non-obedient, non-conformist, how are we different? Why are we different? What are things about a situation that might make us obey versus things about us, our disposition, that might make us obey or not? So sometimes it's the situation you're in that forces you to obey or not. And sometimes it's just something about you, like you're extroverted or introverted, or you're conscientious or you're not. And those are the things that factor into whether or not you're going to obey. So I want you talking about those factors. Pick those out. You're not going to find all of them in this reading. You're going to have to reference the main textbook, which is great because many of you haven't been doing that. You should be going back into chapter 10 and pulling out some of the findings, some of the research that's talked about in this area and integrating it into your responses, okay? How do you think people today would respond to the Milgram experiment? So here's where knowing this video is going to come in handy for answering this question here. And I say, here's where you should be integrating the video. And then lastly, this kind of requires you to go out on a limb a little bit. I want you to describe at least one event, recent event, last 10 years that mirrors the Milgram study. If I start seeing everyone mentioning the same event, I'm going to kind of wonder if people are not looking at other people's posts and then just writing the same thing. This is 10 years. There's been so much that's happened in our world in 10 years that mirrors the Milgram study. Obedience, authority, conformity. Find something, in the media in the last 10 years that mimics what happened in Milgram. Why did people in Milgram obey even when they knew they shouldn't? Even when they felt like they didn't want to? Why did they obey? What factors compelled them to obey? And find something in recent history that's kind of had that same effect, okay? So that's your discussion. And then lastly, you have a quiz this week that closes by Friday. That is it. Hoping to see some really good posts. People are getting better, but it is already week 10. We only have 5 more weeks in the semester. So, really integrating the readings and the videos into your responses, not only in your original response, but in your responses to others, is what's going to really help you get a better score on your reading summaries. Remember to pay attention to spelling. Always capitalize I. You would never hand in a paper, I hope, with I being lowercase throughout the paper. So pay attention to editing, spelling, proper sentence structure, full sentences, and support all your answers. Okay? Have a great week, everybody.